What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and Labor Day weekend is the biggest fantasy football draft weekend in the entire summer. So I imagine a lot of you guys are searching YouTube, cramming in before your draft. So today, I am giving you guys a crash course on how to draft the perfect team and win your league in just 15 minutes. So with that being said, if you enjoy, make sure down below, subscribe, leave a like, let's go.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold, ice around my body like I'm frozen. She gon' let me.
Now, this is very ambitious for me. I am notorious for running long on this channel, making videos that span like 40 minutes to an hour. But let's get straight to it. Let's break it down position by position to talk through how we are going to draft the perfect team in fantasy football. Now, first, we're going to outline running backs here. And the biggest thing to understand with running backs is when you draft them, you have to be mindful of when and where and how many you're drafting because of the risk that they bring. Now, when I talk about that risk, we are talking about injury. We're talking about short shelf life, where we've seen guys like Todd Gurley and David Johnson, Le'Veon Bell all fall right off a cliff. And they're also getting hurt at a higher rate in the earlier rounds, where the top 24 ADP wide receivers, this is a great study from Josh Hermsmeyer over at RotoViz. Serious injury rate means like being out for longer than like 5 or 6 weeks. Top 24 ADP wide receivers, about 18.3%. Top 24 ADP running backs, 45.4%. That is a huge, huge difference where running backs are busting at a high rate and they carry a ton of risk inherently. And we can see from the last 2 years of data from Underdog. By the way, we're going to be using some best ball data in this video. Best ball data is just a good way of compiling stats and data across thousands of leagues with actual money on the line. When you take into account like your ESPN data from home leagues and stuff, there's a lot of transactions happening. There's a lot of trades and waivers, and it muddies the data. You have kids on there. There's free leagues. So best ball is just a way to sort of get the macro principles and then apply it to the micro stuff here in your home leagues. Now, we can see in terms of advance rate over and under expected, the first 6 rounds, running backs are weighing down your team. Now, that's not to say that we don't draft any running backs in those first 5 to 6 rounds, but it's just important to know that inherently running backs have been negative EV picks in those first 6 rounds. So we don't want to draft too many of them. We don't want to draft like 5, 6, 7 running backs through the first 10 rounds. And we also want to be very mindful when we're drafting these running backs that we need to be shooting for upside. Now, this is an idea outlined by Pat Crane. He won Best Ball Mania 3 last year. We've had him on the channel before. And he outlines this idea that if you're going to draft a running back early, he needs to have legendary upside. Legendary upside, I have defined it for this channel as 22.5 or more points per game. You can see here, wide receivers since 2018 have about kept pace with running backs. And then once you get to 22.5 plus points per game, running backs are blowing them out of the water. And here's the important thing. Where are we drafting these 22.5 plus point per game guys? And we can see since 2010, every running back, there's been 17 seasons of 22.5 plus points per game. They have all come in the first 3 rounds of fantasy drafts, which leads us to the RB dead zone. Now, in terms of these early rounds, I'm going to be giving some targets, sprinkling in some targets here and there in this video. If you're going to draft a running back early that has that 22.5 plus point per game upside, my favorite options are Bijan Robinson and Tony Pollard. Now, when we get past the first 3 rounds, generally speaking, we want to be avoiding running backs in this RB dead zone, where if we look at the advance rates from running backs over the last 2 years, again, first 3 rounds, that's where you're getting your 22.5 plus point per game area, guys. So that's when it's justified to take that swing and sort of sift through that Red Sea. In rounds 4 through 6, you're not getting a ton of upside there. Now, I will say, only sit, steal, and absolutes, okay? So we're not never drafting running backs in rounds 4 through 6. We're just trying to avoid it. But if you find yourself drafting a running back in rounds 4 through 6, I like Breece Hall, Travis Etienne, J.K. Dobbins, and Dameon Pierce if I'm taking swings in that dead zone. Now, moving on from that, you can see there is super green areas of this draft, rounds 7 through 10. That's where you want to be prioritizing and hammering running backs. I love these guys. I call it the green zone here, the money zone. Last year, you had Ramondre Stevenson and Tony Pollard in that range. This year, I really like DeAndre Swift, Antonio Gibson, Jalen Warren, and Tank Bigsby. So when we talk about running backs as a whole, again, you just want to be mindful where the more running backs you take early, the less you want to take late. So if you draft like 1 running back through the first 3 rounds, I kind of want to end up with like somewhere from like 5 to 7 running backs total. If I take like 3 early on, then I might just end up with like 3 or 4. Again, you want to be prioritizing. You can't draft running backs early and late because then you're just taking on a ton of risk on your team, and you're almost betting on the running backs you drafted early not to pay off and to bust anyways. Now, when we talk about running backs busting, getting hurt and everything, Let's talk about handcuffs. Do not draft your own handcuff. I see a lot of people out there, they'll draft let's say they'll draft Christian McCaffrey and then Elijah Mitchell later. You want to play to win. Only 1 out of every 12 teams win, or 1 out of every 10 teams. That's like a 92nd percentile outcome. You need to have a really, really good team to win it all. If your first-round running back gets hurt or busts, you're likely going to lose anyway. So drafting for that scenario is only weighing down your team. Instead, you want to draft other people's handcuffs, because then their teams are getting weaker, and then once their teams are getting weaker, you're also benefiting from that on top. So it's like compounding, where other teams are getting worse as their running backs get hurt, and then you're only getting better because you have their handcuffs. Like, you would rather draft Bijan and then get the benefit of somebody else's McCaffrey going down if you have Elijah Mitchell on your team than you would, taking Bijan and then getting like Tyler Algier on the back half of the season. Like, if Bijan goes down, Tyler Algier is not going to save your fantasy season. Now, the last thing we'll say about running backs here is that if you don't draft 2 to 3 in the early rounds and you are going to take a bunch late, be prepared to churn through running backs on the waivers. Every week you should be prioritizing the waivers. You should be getting a lot of running backs on your bench if you can. The biggest thing to really note here is that when a guy like Najee Harris goes down, Jaylen Warren is a top 12 option. He is an instant RB1. If Devontae Adams goes down, Jacoby Myers is not then a wide receiver 1. So with that in mind, you want your bench spot to have a lot of upside running back profiles, especially, again, if you didn't take a bunch early, because you should just be looking at them as lottery tickets almost. So instead of having like backup, I see all the time people have like backup kickers and defenses and tight ends. None of those guys can win you a league, but if you get a running back where the starter goes down, that guy can then win you a league, which takes us to our wide receiver strategy here. Now, it's important to note, again, Devontae Adams goes down, nobody gets really a huge bump from that. So wide receiver 1s aren't just going to come up off of waivers like they do with handcuffs. So you want to be prioritizing wide receivers early. Personally, I think that there's a tier break after Devontae Adams. In a perfect world, I have one of those top 9 through the first 2 rounds, but you could also just have one of these guys that are on this screenshot through the first 3 rounds and be okay. I do like Jefferson and Chase as my 101 and 102 in all half PPR and full PPR formats. Now, while we're avoiding the RB dead zone in rounds 4 through 6, we should be prioritizing wide receiver in this range with an emphasis on year 2 and 3 breakouts. This was actually a great article by Ryan Heath over the summer where he sort of looked at breakout wide receivers. Years 2 and 3 wide receivers have been huge cheat codes. Last year we saw Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jalen Waddle. Before that, we've seen Debo and Jamar Chase. We've seen guys like DK Metcalf go crazy, Calvin Ridley in his 3rd year, Chris Godwin in his 3rd year. This year, for me, guys in this range that I like that are kind of in that year 2, year 3 area, I love Drake London and Christian Watson. You can also put in like Chris Olave, but he's mostly a 2nd round pick in most spots. But yeah, Drake London and Christian Watson in that rounds 4 to 6 range, I really like. Now, it's important to not only just draft wide receivers in that rounds 4 through 6 area, but you want to make sure that you have stacked options at wide receiver to play through your flex. Because if you get screwed out of wide receiver, you're going to have to start reaching for like Greg Dortch off of waivers and like putting that guy in your lineup. And that never feels good. Again, you can get running backs off of waivers and off of handcuffs just with the attrition of a season on the health of running backs, where with wide receivers, it's not the same. So I always like to be, over-prepared than under-prepared when it comes to wide receiver. And my rule of thumb across all drafts is to have wide receivers through your flex, right? So if you have, this is pretty much a chart. So 2 wide receiver, 1 flex, you want 4 to 5 wide receivers by the time you get to round 10, right? So wide receivers through your flex, that's 2 wide receivers plus a flex, that's 3, plus another 1 or 2, that's 4 or 5. And you can just sort of take that through every format I have listed here. Now, I will say you also want to take a note of if you have like standard, half PPR, full PPR. The more PPR you have on your league, the more you should be emphasizing wide receivers. Now, when we talk about settings, that sort of naturally takes us to tight end strategy here, which settings impact a ton your tight end and quarterback strategy here, where this is wins over replacement. This is just stock wins over replacement for a like 12-man league, or it might be a 10-man or 12-man league with like 9 starting spots. I just want to show you how much of a gap there is with Travis Kelce up there at the orange. That's what the orange, that orange dot is just Travis Kelce, then the next, right? So that's a huge, huge boost. And the shallower your league is, right? So like 10 teams, 8 teams, if it's like, instead of it being 3 wide receiver, 1 flex, it's like 2 wide receiver, 1 flex, and it's like a 10-team league, then you want to be prioritizing Kelce. Like that's when you start moving up a Kelce from like, I have him maybe like 7th or 8th in my rankings, but if I'm in an 8-team, 2 wide receiver, 1 flex league, then Travis Kelce has a case to go like 4th overall, 3rd overall in that format. So know your format, know your league settings, know how shallow it is. And, it really comes down to the bigger percentage that tight end takes up in your lineup, and the less teams there are in your league, the more you want to be prioritizing a guy like Kelsey or Mark Andrews. When we talk about tight ends just in general now, when we sort of zoom out, I either go one early or too late. There's low-key, like, kind of a dead zone in the tight end space. This is the last 2 years of underdog data, where you can see the first 2 rounds, tight end is really good to draft, and then after that, rounds 3 through 6, it's been pretty brutal there, where in years past, you've had Kyle Pitts has been rough there, Darren Waller was rough there last year. It just hasn't been great. Like, in a perfect world, you either draft Kelsey or Andrews, and I sort of also highlighted where this dead zone is among tight ends, right? I would say Kelsey and Andrews are in that elite top 2 round tier. Then you have Hawkinson through Kittle that fit rounds 3 through 6. And then from then on, you can draft whoever. And my sort of strategy when it comes to this is I'm either taking Kelsey or Andrews, or I'm going up with, like, upside options later with, like, Freiermuth, Kincaid, Sam Laporta, Greg Dulcich. Again, if you take a guy like Kelsey, don't draft a Dallas Goedert. Don't even draft like a Greg Dulcich. You don't need a backup. You can just stream that when his bye week comes around. You want to be prioritizing that bench space for running backs. You don't want to have, like, a backup tight end behind Travis Kelce. There's truly no reason to do that. Now, I will say, again, these are not strict rules. If you end up drafting a tight end in that rounds 3 through 6 area, my bet this year would be on Darren Waller. Now, moving on to QB strategy here. All right, we're making decent time. We have QB strategy. QB is pretty much the same as tight end, where there's also a dead zone here, which was really interesting to me. And the dead zone sort of cuts off, like, Deshaun Watson and Tua. We're around 7 through 10. QBs the last 2 years haven't been great bets. So I would be drafting either one of Mahomes through Lawrence. If I draft one of those guys in a home league, I'm just drafting them. If you get past that and you go to, like, Richardson, Dak, Daniel Jones, whatever, at that point, I like to draft 2 just to have sort of options there. But even then, you can get a little bit thinner. Now, I will say, technically, the dead zone does stretch to Anthony Richardson, but in an underdog league, because you can't stream quarterbacks get pushed up. So in a home league, Anthony Richardson, you're going to be able to get later on. Again, I'm either trying to get elite quarterbacks early, which is a very viable strategy, by the way. You can see, like, it's a brighter green early on. Like, elite QB has been very, very good the last 2 years. My personal guys are Lamar Jackson and Justin Herbert this year. But if you're going to wait till later, I would grab 2 guys in the 10th round or later. I do absolutely love right now Anthony Richardson and, like, Daniel Jones have been great. Now, I do want to make a note on stacks here, where stacking is very important. You want to make sure that you are stacking to your quarterback. You stack a pass catcher to your quarterback, which the reason we do this is for 2 reasons. First, if you have Justin Herbert and you add, like, a Mike Williams, then you are already betting on the passing offense when you drafted Justin Herbert. So when you draft a Mike Williams, you are just adding on to that same bet. So instead of having to do, like, a 2-bet parlay, it is just one singular bet. You're betting on the passing offense already. Mike Williams goes with that. If Herbert has a good year, Mike Williams also has a good year, most likely. Now, people are going to say, well, what about on a weekly basis when they both don't do well? Well, here's the thing. Most matchups in fantasy football aren't decided by 10 points. I actually looked through the matchups for my 12-man home league from weeks 1 through 14, and the average margin of victory was 27.4 points, with just 17.9% of matchups getting decided by less than 10 points. 50% of the matchups were decided by 25 or more points, which means if you spotted Austin Eckler to the losing team, 50% of the time, it wouldn't even be enough. So you have to sort of embrace the nature that most matchups, even though, like, if you get burned by, like, a couple points, it feels really bad, most matchups are decided by a ton of points. So you want your boom weeks to be synchronized, and when Justin Herbert throws a touchdown and it hits Mike Williams, you're likely going to win in that given week, and you want to be prioritizing that sort of thing. Now, some random notes here as we sort of wind down. Everything comes out in the wash. When it comes to bye weeks, don't get too crazy about it. Bye weeks only matter to me when I'm drafting backup quarterbacks or tight ends, right? If you're drafting a backup quarterback, you'd like to have a guy that's not going to be on bye at the same time. Same thing with tight end. But outside of that, teams change so much. You're turning waivers so much. Like, it doesn't really matter. And we already know matchups are sort of blowouts anyway, so there's no real reason to prioritize, the floor of your team over an entire season when you're almost at an advantage to kind of punt 1 week and be really stacked up the rest of the time. Now, also, note on kicker and defense. I don't do a ton of research on kicker and defense, but I will say, take them in the last couple rounds. Don't be the first guy to take a kicker or defense in your league. Again, we want to be prioritizing those upside picks, those handcuffs in the late rounds, not be reaching up for being the first guy to take a defense or first guy to take a kicker. I take it in the last few rounds, and the guy that I've used recently or over the last couple of years who's done me well has been Subvertodown. He has a website, subvertodown.com. I've never even met the guy or anything, but he's pretty good. Again, you don't want to have a backup kicker or defense, a backup tight end or backup quarterback if there are elite options there. You want as much space to sort of get this year's like Jamal Williams, Jeff Wilson types. Now, our last thing that we're going to say here, practice. Make sure, first of all, you check out Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the best ball platform in the game. The ADP is the sharpest ever. Everyone's using real money on the line. So that ADP has been going on since the spring, and it's super sharp, and it's not janky like a lot of these home league sites. So you can kind of get a feel for that. You can use promo code RON. I'll link in the description and comment section down below. It'll match your deposit up to $100. You hop on Underdog, you get some practice, and you see where players should be going, and you hop onto your home league platform, and you do a couple mock drafts, get a feel for kind of how your home league does, and you get into your home league draft, and you absolutely crush. Now, bonus here, if you really want to crush your draft, check out patreon.com/Ron Stewart. I have my top 200 rankings there. I have a checklist. The exact cheat sheet and checklist that I bring into every single draft will be there. So make sure you check it out. Patreon.com/Ron Stewart. I have a link in the description and a link in the comment section down below. We pretty much got to 15 there. As always, I appreciate you guys. That was a crash course on how to draft the perfect team to win your league in 2023. And as always, I will see you guys in the next one.
Stones, like this froze, ice cold.